Obviously, there won't be any votes. We won't do any of those items until
We will need Melissa.
and unless we have a third member. But since we don't have an accurate or a precise ETA, I don't want us sitting here for half an hour and not use the time to at least discuss the informational items. So I won't officially call the meeting to order, but why don't we, unless there's an objection to this, why don't we at least start with public comment, and then we'll jump to items 4 and 5, since those are informational. So I have one speaker card from Barbara Stebbins, so if you would like to address the committee, please do so. Just give that button a tap.
So I have to say, it doesn't seem fair for us to give public comment when there's only 2 of you here, and I'm not saying that we don't think of course we think you're worth it, but...
I'm happy to hold it until later if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I'd rather, we came all the way, from further north on BART, 35 minutes, we just
I'm happy
assume
to
wait a
hold
little
it,
while.
and we'll do it. We'll do it.
Other people may want to speak now, but I would just soon wait. Thanks.
Yep, no problem. That's why I asked if there were any objections. Are there any objections to proceeding with item 4, the regulatory and legislative update, which is an informational item, and I don't have any speakers? Are there any objections to us doing that?
Yes, I think I have the same objection that Barbara expressed. Third member has arrived.
Okay. Well, we have our third member, so I'm going to go ahead and formally start the meeting and ask for a roll call. Ms. Cabrera?
Alameda County. Here. Emeryville.
Here.
Hayward.
Here.
Thank you. Berkeley and Oakland are excused.
Okay, thank you. And we do have a quorum, so let's do public comment now. We do have a quorum, so Barbara Stebbins, please come forward. Okay, Barbara Stebbins, public comment.
Okay, so this comment is in support of our proposal that the East Bay Community Energy Board support the current motion before the Public Utilities Commission to shut down Diablo Canyon before 2024-25. And basically, many people have made reference to the fact that this agency, from its steering committee inception days, had made it clear we did not want nuclear in our mix. I finally found a written reference from a staff presentation, January 17th, 2018, which says no coal, no nuclear when the rates and the resource mix was being considered. So it's clear that at least by that point in EBCE's history, it was acknowledged and acknowledged by staff that we did not want to include nuclear in our mix. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Any other public comments on items that are not on the agenda? Okay, then the minutes from November 22nd. Motion to be appreciated. Okay, any objection to approving the minutes? Hearing none, they are passed unanimously amongst the members who are present. Okay, the regulatory and legislative affairs update. It's an informational item.
There we go. Thank you. I'm going to do the legislative update, and then Todd Edmister is going to do the regulatory update.
That's fine.
So to start with legislative, actually this is not the first slide. There we go. The legislature just reconvened this month on the 6th. So now things are starting to move fast and furious within the legislature. I think what's key here is there's a bill introduction deadline of February 21st. And so actually today is the deadline to get language into Leg Council in time to get it introduced by the 21st. So a lot of folks have started to get their initial bill ideas in today and or spot bills in some cases. We haven't seen a lot of bills yet pertaining to energy. A lot of the bills we're seeing are pertaining more to PG&E and to bankruptcy or to PSPS, but not necessarily something that affects EBCE. We expect those bills to come, but we just haven't really seen it yet. We'll know a lot more after February 21st. Just other key things to note here is one of the things that we really focus on is when bills are in policy committees, because that's an opportunity to, seek amendments if we need or have our point of view entertained. Once they go from policy committees to the floor, sometimes it's a little bit harder at that point to actually get changes in. And then on 8/31 is the last day for each house to pass bills this year. Whoops. So I put together a preliminary bill tracker. Like I said, we haven't seen a lot of energy bills yet, so I think this is going to change pretty substantially over the course of the next couple months. But just looking at kind of what we've had some visibility into so far, I wanted to highlight these bills for you. I think particularly noteworthy is AB 56 and SB 350. These were bills that we were dealing with last year, and both of them ended up being turned into 2-year bills. And so they have passed their first House of Origin. They're both in their second House of Origin policy committee right now, and we are expecting amendments to both. So AB 56 failed to make it out of policy committee last year, and Assemblymember Garcia, the author, committed to working with Senator Hertzberg on their parallel bills. So we don't really know what's coming, but the important thing about these bills is they would establish some sort of central procurement mechanism. And so that's always given us a little bit of pause, because the more central procurement the state is doing, the less procurement that EBCE has control over. So we're going to keep watching. I think right now our position from last year on AB 56 was opposed unless amended. SB 350 always looked a little bit more like a spot bill. The language hadn't really been developed yet, so we've just been watching that one. We never took a formal position, but depending on what we see, we may want to oppose. And then I also highlight up here the bill AB 1839 that was the Bonta bill that we talked about on Wednesday night at the board meeting, and that the board has agreed to support. So that one's marked support. Senator Glazer has introduced a couple bills regarding backup electricity. One of them targets medical baseline customers, so I think that's one we're going to want to take a closer look at. The other one would allow air districts to or would require our districts to allow health facilities that require backup generators to be able to use those backup generators without that counting against their time limitations in that year. So that one might have more of a deleterious impact on local air quality. So I think we're also going to want to watch that one. But essentially, like I said, we're going to have a better update in the next couple months as more bills come our way. And so finally, next steps, we're going to continue to review and analyze new bills as they come across our desk. We're going to monitor the existing bills on our preliminary watch list. We'll monitor the governor's budget request. The governor submitted that in January as required. And there's not a lot in there that would intersect with our world, but I highlighted here the few things that could be of interest to us, particularly any funds for climate resiliency. Some of this is going to go towards things that may not pertain to EBCE, but there may be some funds for things like microgrids, backup power, and distributed energy resources, so we'll try to keep an eye on that as it goes forward. And then finally, we're continuing to engage, as we always do with CalCCA, on legislative efforts. So CalCCA is considering whether they want to sponsor a bill this year, and we'll continue working closely with them. And then I also wanted to point out that March 10th is CalCCA Lobby Day. And so this is a day that we try to meet with our delegation up in Sacramento. Other CCAs try to do the same. There's a reception in the evening for lawmakers in their offices. And one of the things that we've been asked to do is invite our board. So I'd like to invite all of you and anybody else on the board. If you would like to join us, please let me know, and we can arrange that. It's always great for our legislators to hear directly from our board, so this is a good opportunity for that.
And that is up in Sacramento, you said?
That is, yeah. It'll be all day on the 10th of March.
And you should, if we could extend that invitation to the full board.
Yep, I'll send an email.
That'd be great, thank you. Lisa. Questions? Scott? Supervisor Haggerty, sorry.
My parents' name.
We're in this room, I feel like I should be using titles.
First question was that I had was, please mail it out, email it to us so we can, get it on our calendars or appropriately respond to you so you know who's coming. But to what extent are we tracking, or is any of these bills that you currently are talking to are related to cap and trade?
Related to cap and trade? I haven't seen much in the cap and trade realm. I do think the governor's budget did want to use some cap and trade funds as part of this climate resiliency effort, so I think that's the tie-in.
My understanding, and I don't know enough to talk about, to be honest with you, but Senator Quirk was at, Assembly Member Quirk was at the BARC meeting. Do you know what BARC is?
No.
It's the Bay Area Regional Collaborative, which is the Air District, MTC, ABAG, Coastal Conservancy, and BCDC.
Okay.
It's all board members. My understanding there is a bill that is moving through the Assembly now that basically is going to a lot, and they're looking for an agency. Should it be the state or should it be a local agency? And to allocate the funds from, I don't want to say all the funds of cap and trade, but I'm like know enough to be dangerous right now. I'm just being really honest. Yeah. But I really think we should find out what that is.
Okay.
And really get into that, because right now, Quirk was talking about maybe an agency like BARC should be doing the passing out of the money, and maybe we want to get our hands in that too.
Okay, yeah, I'll take a look. I don't know if he's introduced it yet. I haven't seen it, but I'll definitely keep my eyes.
I don't know if he's the author or if he just came and spoke to us.
Okay.
Okay. Councilmember Martinez, any?
I just was wondering if you'd be able to update us on which of our local representatives in state legislature are on policy committees that might be a place where bills are getting stuck, just in case we could be of any service. I know you give us alerts when there are folks that you want us to reach out to, but if we can be proactive in any way, I'm curious.
So I think the two members that are probably most relevant for us are the ones that are on our either the Assembly Utilities and Energy or the Senate Energy, Utilities, and Communications Committees. And so that would be Assemblymember Quirk on the Assembly side and Senator Skinner on the Senate side.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, and I have just one public comment speaker, Audrey. I'm having trouble reading. Is it Ichinose?
Ichinose.
Okay, Ichinose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's always a test.
Yeah, I'm much better with
And you
first
guys are
names.
doing okay. You guys are doing okay. So, So actually, my question is to the board, to the staff. Now, what would it take, given the prominence of the nuclear allotment issue as it affects the PCIA, what would it take for EBCE, legislative and other sort of divisions of this effort in Sacramento to expand? What would it, what impedes EBCE's advocacy of an early shutdown of Diablo Canyon? That is my question. I mean, political, physical.
I think the advocacy around an early shutdown of Diablo and taking the allocation are fairly distinct from one another. So I think whether or not East Bay the board decides to take an allocation of nuclear or not, I think there's a separate policy conversation around whether or not to advocate for the early retirement of Diablo. It is true that Diablo causes tremendous costs for all customers. I think, practically speaking, it's the amount of time to spend on the advocacy given the low likelihood of success of getting the PUC to retire a plant early that is going to start retiring in 4 years. The other challenge, and this is not so much an EBC issue, but an issue at the PUC case, is there's great concern at the CPUC about what replaces Diablo Canyon. So there have been quite some lessons learned from Germany, where they shut down thousands and thousands of megawatts of nuclear generation. And what they experienced over the last decade was coal often stepped in to replace that generation. Now, obviously in California that would not be the case, but there's concern that natural gas will step in. And so they have a whole proceeding around distributed energy resources and renewables and energy efficiency to be procured to replace Diablo Canyon. And I think, again, I'm speaking of sort of my observation of what I think the PUC is thinking, that they want to provide adequate time for those resources to be built out so we don't see a spike in emissions when Diablo is retired.
I understand that, and actually I wanted to point out that the German case is quite misleading. It's not a good analogy because the use of coal in Germany is really goes back to German reunification. And since so much of the coal production occurs in the eastern Germany. So it's not, they have, it's actually courageous on their part to have, to decide to decommission their plants. So you can't use coal as a...
Yeah, well, I'm not making the argument, I'm just sort of saying that is the rationale that the California Public Utilities Commission has focused on, is they want to make sure that there is a very clear plan to replace Diablo with clean energy and not have natural gas plants running more often.
Sure, okay. And also, I would like to, could I not respond? Thank you very much. I appreciate your indulgence, actually, at the beginning as well. And that is that,
Briefly,
yes, the issues are really intimately linked. The PCIA increase and this question of nuclear allotment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on this item? The regulatory affairs? So you said there was we had the legislative, now it's the regulatory? Yeah. Yeah, so okay, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, Todd Edmister, Director of Regulatory Affairs. So let's go ahead and lead with the ERA forecast discussion. I think a fair bit of this we've been over again. This is really background. Following up on Wednesday, the big event here, the news item, is that about 2 hours ago we got the PUC's proposed decision in the ERA forecast proceeding. So we talked about on Wednesday how we didn't have all the numbers in hand. Now we actually have a new set of numbers to work with. The bottom line there is that we've been asking for about $400 million in reduction for PG&E's revenue requirement, roughly a quarter of what they were what they were looking for. Of that, we're gonna for sure pick up about $100 million or so. PG&E essentially laid down on about $100 million worth of issues that we had raised. Another $100 million is coming through as well. As for the balance, the remaining $200 million, $100 million in the PD we lose outright on. The other $100 million issue gets punted to another proceeding to be resolved. It will be litigated throughout the course of this year, probably resolved around the end of this year. So that's the upshot of the proposed decision. Now, we'll be arguing back on the $100 million that we lost outright. We don't think that the rationale for that really makes any sense. So that's not a done deal, and we'll be working on that over the course of the next month. But that's the current state of play on the ERA forecast proceeding. Questions?
So those numbers you were throwing around
Yeah.
were in totality, not specifically the impact.
Correct. So our next step, and we're working on this right now, is to figure out what is the bottom line impact for EBC, and we'll be modeling that.
Okay, but it sounds like it's going to be in the 20 to 25% of the worst case scenario that we were discussing 2 minutes ago.
It's going to be about 50% of the worst case scenario, I
50%.
think.
So
Yeah.
if you
Nick,
think
do you
about
have
the
some
mid-
better sense of the numbers?
I think we're thinking we'll get closer to the mid-case scenario, which was still
Pretty bad.
Pretty bad.
bad.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to, in terms of the regulatory next sort of impacts, we're definitely going to be at this cap, right? We're going to see a half-cent increase in the PCIA. We've talked about the trigger. So because of the cap, there's going to be this undercollection of the capped rate versus we call it the uncapped rate, or sort of the nominal rate they should have been receiving. And based on our running of those numbers, we're looking at hitting the filing trigger probably mid-August. So we would expect to see PG&E coming in late August, early September, saying, hey, PUC, do something to stop this undercollection and actually start to draw it down. And then the PUC would act on that on whatever timeline they deem appropriate, probably within the next 3 months. So end of the year, we would expect to see something happening around the trigger and potentially a raise in rates above the cap level. We'll have to see. All of that is still very much up in the air. But in terms of timing, we think that'll be in play end of August, early September.
Okay. Did you have more in your presentation, or was that big enough news that you wanted to talk
Well,
about?
that's the big news item. There is more. Some of this is a heads up. So we've talked about this. The rehearing application being denied. Covered that on Wednesday. The working groups, we also touched on that on Wednesday. So I'll skip forward past that for now. I want to talk really about direct access, because I don't think we've talked about that much. And so direct access is retail choice at the individual customer level, right? So we're a form of customer choice. Customers can choose the community choice aggregator, or they can choose the incumbent utility. This would allow some subset of customers to choose a provider as individuals, so they could opt out and not go back to the utility, but go to a particular entity that's selling power, right? The legislative background is all here. The punchline is that pursuant to this Hertzberg bill, SB 237, which reopened direct access up to certain limits, the PUC has to make recommendations to the commission on kind of whether to reopen direct access further. And so those recommendations are due from the commission to the legislature in mid-June. And we're in the midst right now of working as parties in a commission proceeding with the commission staff to shape the recommendations that the commission will make to the legislature. And then all of this will be a prelude to a legislative process to make some further decisions about what's the retail market in California going to look like, which obviously has big implications for us. So right now, we filed comments with the PUC staff, comments on the PUC staff last week, saying basically we don't think you can expand direct access right now. A lot of reasons why not, but the bottom line is you should not be recommending to the legislature that there be a schedule set for expanding direct access. There's a whole bunch of spade work that has to be done if that's the direction that you want to go, and you, Commission, have not engaged on that at all. Plus, the legislature set some criteria, primarily relating to greenhouse gas impacts, criteria pollutant emissions, customer impacts. where the commission would have to make certain findings, which they lack the data to make the findings on, and the information that we had suggested that there would in fact be increases in GHG emissions, increase in criteria pollutant emissions, so forth on down the line. So we file or serve these comments with staff saying, don't reopen direct access, you got to look at all these other issues before you can recommend doing so. Obviously, the folks that sell direct access services take a different view, and we'll be filing reply comments on Monday, serving reply comments on staff on Monday. Expect to see a staff report to the commission sometime February, March, which the commission would then vote out in January. So that's the current state of affairs there, and then ultimately it goes to the legislature. Sir.
Supervisor Hagerty.
Yeah, thank you. I'm curious, and this thought just dawned on me, so maybe you've talked about it. I just wasn't paying attention, but when a direct access customer goes out and purchases energy, does it have to be clean, or can they go buy some coal from Alabama and then, you know, it comes into the grid?
Yeah, so they are, so we're one of a species of load-serving entities, okay? So CCAs serve load, utilities serve load, ESPs serve load. All LSEs in California are subject to the RPS. So we all have to buy the Renewable Portfolio Standard. So we all have to buy a certain percentage of our energy.
But not necessarily the standards that we've set for ourselves.
Correct. And so one of the arguments that we were making, I think this is a central argument, right? So the legislature said, hey, commission, before you make a recommendation, you have to determine that whatever you're suggesting would be consistent with the state's GHG reduction policies and not increase criteria pollutant emissions. And so we have this graph that shows here's us and here's these guys.
What about cities and counties' climate action plans and the damage that maybe they do to that? Are we talking about that also?
That is not one of the legislative criteria, so we have not specifically referenced that beyond generally saying.
I mean, a lot of us, I think, have put this CCA into our climate action plan, and I would think that, you know, if you had a big producer, for example, here in Hayward, that wasn't following our goals, that would affect the climate action plan that Hayward's put in effect. Mm-hmm. So to me, it seems like that should be a talking point.
Okay. That's a good point. We've been making it
Plans are a farce.
Yeah, we've been making it at a higher level, which is that whenever you move off of us to these guys, you're going browner.
I think that point is a really important point to make in advocacy. So we make the high-level point that it's going from CCA to direct access means more dirty power, and then sort of as we start to sort of go and meet with commissioners or potentially meet with legislators, that's the point I think to make. Because unfortunately, the PUC doesn't seem to care very much about local government climate action plans in their decision making. But legislators, I think, care deeply about, their cities, often, councils that they came from being able to achieve the goals that, they, in some cases, had a hand in setting.
I think the governor cares too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Any other?
That's it.
Yeah. I mean, I had a similar point, which is just that we really should be emphasizing the fact that the direct access power is dirtier. And every chance we get, and because especially on the legislative side, because that's one thing that ought to resonate with them, it's fairly simple and straightforward and easy to understand. And that may not hold sway with the CPUC if they're, as above the minimums, right? But our legislators hopefully will be a little bit more discerning.
Yeah, we have some really good graphics that show exactly that. You look at the power content label, because, to your question about do they do it with Alabama coal, they don't do it with Alabama coal, but they do buy brown power and then cover it up with RECs from out of state to the maximum extent that they can. That's part of their cost minimization strategy, and we've surfaced that for sure. It's front and center.
And on the climate action plan, I think, I take the point from staff. It's probably not going to hold much sway. It is worth noting, since you pointed out Hayward, or you brought up Hayward, that we set a goal of 20% reduction by 2020, and we are calculating that we are right at the 20% with the CCA. And so any erosion of that is likely to put us below the target. Again, not going to be persuasive with CPUC, I understand, but Assemblymember Quirk voted for that climate action plan when he was on the council, and so it might be persuasive with him, or at least of note with him. Okay, anything else on this item? I don't have any more speaker cards because it was sort of merged with the previous one, but does anyone want to come up and comment on item 4? To staff, in the future, I think the regulatory and the legislative updates probably should be 2 separate items, since we sort of, I treated it that way. Maybe I shouldn't have, but I think that 2 different staff reports, it'd be nice to separate them. Okay. Okay, then moving on to item 5, which is the carbon-free allocation. This is again an informational item, but I have lots of speakers on this one.
Okay.
So who's going to?
So I will start. So on Wednesday, there was a presentation on both the expected impacts of the PCIA, which we're getting more clarity on than we had, and unfortunately, the impacts are looking more significant, or the significant impacts are looking more likely than not at this point. And so there's a question of timing when those effects start hitting our bottom line. It might be May, it might be August, it could be even 2021. It really just sort of depends on when the implementation occurs. But when that occurs, there will be a significant effect on the organization's finances. And practically speaking, what that likely means, if we see sort of that 30% reduction in revenue, is we're going to find ourselves in a place where setting our rates at 1.5% below PG&E, or in the case of Brilliant 100 at parity, will not generate enough revenue to cover our costs. So, we do have reserves, we can allocate reserves, but at a certain point, you have to start to think about other remedial measures. And, fundamentally, there are 2 remedial measures, and I think the carbon allocation is a strategy, but there's fundamentally, we reduce our costs or we raise our rates. And very likely you need to sort of pursue both strategies in tandem, and you try to find what is that optimal, what are the optimal set of cost-cutting strategies and rate increases that allow us to, as closely as possible, continue to sort of achieve our sort of organizational goals of cleaner, cheaper, and local. So it's in that context that we're starting to look for what are the strategies that are going to be available to us. When you think about reducing costs, there's a sort of a base, I would call it almost fixed cost to serve customers, that is just you have to go and buy electricity from sources of generation. Where you have opportunities to reduce costs is to reduce your discretionary expenditures. The areas where we have discretionary energy expenditures are purchases of renewables above the RPS minimum and our purchases of carbon-free energy. Those are policy decisions that the board has made. Those are not to meet. Anything above the minimum RPS is not to meet, in the short term, a regulatory or legal obligation of the state. So those are your energy procurement sort of cost-cutting opportunities. The magnitude of the savings that we can achieve is something that we're looking into. I think it's also important to know, and this was in the staff report on Wednesday, that our expectation is because PG&E will be allocating some amount, at the very least large hydro and potentially nuclear to some CCAs, we do expect their carbon-free content to go down. So, they may have been in the mid-80s in 2019. The expectation is that they will sort of dip because they won't be retaining the hydro or the nuclear, or the same amount of hydro and nuclear. So in the context of changing our carbon-free content, for our base product, if the fundamental goal is to be cleaner than PG&E, there may be an opportunity to move from 85% to a lower carbon-free content while continuing to exceed PG&E's carbon-free content. Evaluating that is something that we're going to be doing over the coming weeks. There's also the question of the treatment of nuclear. And so if indeed EBC decides that taking nuclear into our mix in any shape or form is something that is against our organizational values, then that raises the question, should we be comparing ourselves to PG&E the portion of the PG&E power that comes from nuclear. If we don't deem it to be clean and we're saying we need to be cleaner than PG&E, should we be comparing ourselves to PG&E when we view nuclear as dirty power? So it's in that context that I think, that's the framing of really looking at, what if any potential adjustments to our power content may be made, and what are the potential financial benefits of making those changes. So that's something that we're going to be coming back with some further analysis, but I think what I'm looking for is some sense of prioritization. And so the other area is relates to our discount. So we offer a 1.5% discount for Bright Choice and price parity for Brilliant 100. 1 cent more for Renewable 100, but it's a very small percentage of our customers. So I'm really focused on Bright Choice and Brilliant 100. One thing that we're finding over the last year is that the cost differential between Bright Choice and Brilliant 100 is more than 1.5%. So we initially priced it at 1.5% because we found our estimates were that that's roughly what the cost differential to go from Bright Choice to Brilliant 100 would be for us. We're finding that it's more like 5%, the cost differential. And that's largely driven by the fact that large hydro has been more expensive than we had anticipated in 2018. And the challenge is accessing the volumes of large hydro we want have meant that there's more renewable energy in Brilliant 100 than the minimum. So instead of it being 40% renewable and 60% large hydro, it is closer to 50 or more % renewable. That's how we've been able to find the clean power to get to Brilliant 100. So it's in that context that I think we need to evaluate what are the incremental cost savings of moving from 1.5% discount to a 1%, 0.5%, or even a lesser discount. And also when looking at Brilliant 100 to say, well, looking to price Brilliant 100 closer to what we view as the cost to buy Brilliant 100. So that the revenue we're collecting from Brilliant 100 customers reflects the cost to buy the energy and the renewables and the carbon-free energy to meet those customers. So those are sort of the two, I think, primary areas of focus and analysis. One thing that we do expect is that PG&E's generation rate, because of the PCIA increase, may actually go down. So from a customer perspective, we may narrow our discount, but the customer is actually seeing savings because their overall bill is going down. So if PG&E's rates were to say go down 5% and we were to go down 5.5%, so we're maintaining a 0.5% discount, not a 1.5% discount, well, the customer is seeing a 5.5% savings. So from the customer's perspective, there should be some sort of feeling of, hey, I'm saving more than I would have otherwise, than I was saving before, and that could be viewed as positive for customers. So that overall downward trend, while it hurts us, actually benefits our customers. So it's in the context of looking at our value proposition and looking at our power mix that then the carbon-free allocation comes into the equation as another strategy to mitigate revenue reductions. So if we are getting free carbon-free attributes, free carbon-free energy, that can allow us to maintain a relatively higher mix of carbon-free than we would otherwise be able to achieve, while mitigating some of the economic impacts because we're not having to go out and buy. And that's when we refer to sort of the $5+ million of savings. That's assuming if we stay at, say, 85% carbon-free, we reduce our expenses by $5.5 million. That, is a strategy that can go to directly offset the impacts of the PCIA. If we're considering reducing our carbon-free content from, say, 85 to 75%, the allocation might allow us to stay at 85%, so maintain a higher level of carbon-free while achieving sort of the cost savings that you would see at 75%. I think there's one other thing to note, though. If indeed the direction ends up being to pursue an acceptance of particularly the nuclear allocation, there are a variety of ways to allocate the nuclear to allow individual customers or even entire communities to effectively opt out of having nuclear in their mix, but in so doing, they would opt out of the benefit that the free allocation provides. The example I would give is you might create two Brilliant 100 rates. One is a Brilliant 100 with no nuclear, and one is one that has nuclear in it. The one that has no nuclear is priced 4% above PG&E, whereas the Brilliant 100 that takes nuclear, you would take enough nuclear into the mix to allow you to maintain price parity with PG&E. And then that becomes a choice that a community or a customer can make to say, I value savings, or I value price parity, or do I more value not having nuclear in the mix? So those are options, those are considerations. At this point, we don't have a recommendation one way or the other. I think the feedback and direction we're looking for is to some degree less about whether or not we should pursue the allocation of nuclear, but more as we think about changing our carbon-free content or changing our value proposition. If indeed the worst of the PCIA effects come to pass, what do you prioritize? If you have to sort of choose one, we should focus on one versus the other, which one to focus on. I mean, obviously we will look at both, and we'll come back with a suite of options that look at, how do you pull the levers on both sides? But it is helpful for us to get a sense of, is discount something that we just can't move on, or we have to prioritize, or is it maintaining the very high level of carbon free?
Okay, is that the full staff report? So I have four speakers that have submitted cards. Barbara Stebbins, Margie Lewis. Do you mind waiting? Barbara Stebbins, Margie Lewis, Seda Jamaz,
Okay.
Dogan, and then Audrey Ichinose.
So we were actually made aware of what was going to be presented yesterday, because it was presented to the Berkeley Energy Commission in terms of like 3 different pathways, and seeking clarification on how to prioritize those pathways. And Nick basically just stated them right now. But, I actually was talking to my husband. I said, so they're going to have these 3 different options. He said, well, those aren't the only options. And I said, that's right. And that is the most obvious thing, is that that's not the only options. Those 3 pathways, which I think Nick has basically said they're not the only ones. So we would encourage the board to make sure that anytime the staff is asking you to prioritize different pathways, that they come with numbers associated with each of those pathways in terms of what the benefit's going to be and what the cost is going to be. Because quite frankly, I think it would be a very false choice right now to think that the choices are either to accept the nuclear or to keep our value propositions and our resource mix proposition. Because right now we don't even know what the impact of the PCIA will be. And you should remember that last year we were told by staff that it was almost the end of the world for community choice, and we had to be prepared to do everything that we could in order to survive the massive increase to the PCIA. So just pointing that out, could really happen. I think it's important that staff do talk about the worst case, but I'm just saying they did that last year. It didn't really work. I also want you to know that the timing of the board's decision is extremely important to your community, because what we hear from our allied organizations is that they are highly opposed to this. They want an opportunity to speak before you. If we don't hear that the board is making a decision on whether to accept this allocation until Friday after 5 p.m., and the board's meeting the following Wednesday, there is not time for us to get representation from all those community members out here. So that's really important. The other thing is, it's really important for the board to know what they are deciding on. If you are allowing the staff to negotiate the contract, which typically is what you would do, you need to know it is not free of takeaways. What we will be giving up is some aspect of our right to petition or litigate the way the PCIA is figured. That could wind up having a heck of a lot more financial impact on community choice programs than a supposedly one-time allotment, which will not start until March, April, May at the earliest.
Thank you, Barbara.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Lewis, Ms. Dogan, and then Ichinose.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Margie Lewis, and I am a member of Public Bank East Bay and Communities for Better Environment. I am speaking for myself, but I do know the tenor of feeling of the large group, and also the statewide coalition of public banking, which, you know, we just got our bill passed. So we are large, and nobody's in favor of nuclear. I just need to say that. And I want to start by saying that people in the indigenous community, which I am not one of, have a saying that if a tree is poisoned at its roots, it cannot grow. And I am making that analogy because when Barbara mentioned that in 2018, at the start of this, you said no coal, no nuclear. And that is the analogy I'm making, that it's the poisoning at the root, including nuclear. Values are important. That's part of the Green New Deal. So, with that said, I want to say EBCE should not accept the nuclear allotment of carbon-free energy, given that we live in an active fault and seismic zone. And using this energy source is extremely dangerous. Dealing with nuclear waste is a major problem now, and to continue to contribute to creating waste is catastrophic. So far, we have dodged a bullet in terms of a major earthquake in this area. Look what caused the shutdown of San Onofre, leakages that weren't even caused by an earthquake. If we had an earthquake, oh my God, the potential dangers are enormous, and it is not worth, that's why I'm going back to the poison tree root and what we originally said, the potential savings to EBCE's budget. The lack of carbon is not worth the danger of nuclear. Thank you. And the savings is not worth the danger. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ceyda Durmaz-Doğan. I'm an Oakland resident and I'm with Local Clean Energy Alliance. I'm against adding nuclear power to EBC's power mix. And I have a question for the staff. I would like to ask about the reason behind changing the language wording of this, because I remember I attended the executive committee meeting on November 22nd, and when you first presented this to the committee, you mentioned there are three options. Option A, accepting entire allocation. Option B, accepting only hydro allocation. Option C, accepting entire allocation, designating a nuclear-free rate option. And now, like, you are presenting this as 3 pathways and mostly focusing on either increasing carbon intensity of the portfolio or reducing the current discount. And I see that you connected this issue to a PCIA increase, but we learn now that accepting nuclear from PG&E will affect the PCIA formulation. And I'm sure that you probably knew in November 22nd that a possible PCIA increase would happen, but you didn't present the options in a similar way now that you do. So I'm asking, what is the real reason behind this language change? And since I still have time, I would like to also talk about, like, we as Local Clean Energy Alliance have been holding a book club about EBC's local development business plan. And this is to mostly inform the community about what EBC has been doing and like what kind of projects and programs would be more helpful to their communities. And I'm really ashamed to tell them that now, like since November, the only thing that we're talking about in our like meetings, public meetings, is nuclear, rather than like talking about projects and programs that would benefit their communities. Now we're asking people to come here and say that we're against this nuclear power, which was proved to be destructive many, many years ago. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one minor correction. We spent most of our last meeting talking about the local development business plan. Ms. Ichinose? And then Mary Sutter, and then Anna Olivia.
Actually, I don't have much to say, but I do wanted to clarify. What is the dollar amount that we're talking about with that would be our obligation with the new figures that Todd just received?
Dollar impact?
Yes, well, at the Wednesday night meeting, somebody, supervisor asked, board member asked, what would the dollar amount be? And he said, the CFO said, 100 million. And that, of course, would wipe out the 50 million that we have currently in the net position, as well as our reserves. So what dollar amount are we talking about
So
now?
before Nick answers, let's have your comments, ask your questions. I'm going to ask Nick to answer them all at the end, and so I hope you're writing them down.
Okay.
That way we're not taking your time.
Thank you.
Okay.
I don't care.
That was, okay. So, Mary Sutter?
Hi, so I'm speaking to you today as myself, not as the CAC chair, because this hasn't been discussed at all within the CAC. But one of the things that I would hope happens as staff brings back information to the board to consider how to handle this PCI issue and how we want to keep EBCE solvent is to also bring into play metrics that are beyond financial. To start to think about some of the social justice issues, social equity issues, other components. For example, Nick presented information about having 2 tiers. You know, you can then pay a little bit more if you don't want to have nuclear, or if you don't care one way or the other, you just want the lower cost, you have nuclear. It may be that what happens with that is lower income people then essentially don't have a choice. You know, they're going to go for the lower cost type of thing. So I think and hope that as a CCA, we can start to look beyond just financial and look at and bring forward some of these broader social community issues before the board, kind of on equal footing. So they can say, it's worth this amount of money to me to not have this happen, or something like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And Olivia?
Thank you. So I actually am also not here today as the CAC, although I feel like we've discussed a lot of these themes, have built them into our pillars as an organization and built them into our JPA. And I'm in the process of reviewing all those old meetings to see, because we have talked about nuclear before. But I just came from another meeting, the Equitable Climate Action Planning Committee meeting for the City of Oakland. I sit on that body, and I also sit on the MTC Policy Advisory Council. And these concepts come up, and how other agencies' decisions are impacting our communities comes up. And today I had to say, you guys, they're looking at nuclear. And the community, like the communities in that room were really upset. And I have heard this idea before about like maybe if you're wealthy, you can choose not to have to shoulder the moral burden of bringing nuclear into our mix. And every community organization there that represents a Black, brown, or poor community was like, wow, so they're institutionalizing environmental racism. And it is a really difficult narrative to battle. And I love this organization. I have spent a lot of time, as y'all have too, but it is the picture that we are looking at painting right now with those kinds of options. There is a significant difference between being forced to pay for something through the PCIA and entering into a contract and choosing to do so. It impacts how our customers see us. It impacts all kinds of things, and it potentially impacts us legally. There is also, like, in the ECAP, we are working with EBCE to increase electrification in our cities. We're passing local ordinances. We're like banning gas in future builds and looking at how we increase electrification. When we started looking at those charts and being like, what is the overall impact of us taking this allocation on total greenhouse gas emissions, especially if we're looking at issues around increased direct access, we are decreasing the motivation for people to stay with us. Like, we start having a really hard time differentiating ourselves when we adopt dirtier options intentionally. A lot of our cities have resolutions against being nuclear, like against nuclear in general. Certainly our community members do. When you look at approval rates of different sorts of energy, renewable energy has an 80 or 90% approval rate. Nuclear conservatively has over 50% disapproval, and in our communities it actually gets quite higher. So looking at what that impact would be on our cities, on our efforts for electrification, if we're like, electrify this because it's nuclear, like, it's just real gets hard for us who are working in the community to try and convince people it's a good idea. The last thing I've got here, and I'll be fast, is that there does feel like there's a lot of transparency around some of these things. I've been asking repeatedly around cost. I'm getting the difference between cost and incremental cost, which are quite different concepts. People are not feeling like this is super transparent, and so finding ways to open that up would be really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so Nick, were there questions in there that you are prepared to answer?
Yeah, so there was a question about the dollar impact of the PCIA increase. So if you take the figure of a 30% revenue reduction, that equates to roughly $120 million reduction in revenue in 1 year. So that, if you think about, we operate, I think our budget figures estimated that in the year we would be generating $70 million of net revenue. That suggests that we'd be operating at a loss of $50 million.
Which is, absent other changes, would be.
Absent other changes.
Lead to bankruptcy within about 2 years, given our reserves.
Right, we would.
Absent other changes.
Absent other changes, we would eat through our reserves in roughly 2 years, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, my colleagues. Councilmember Martinez.
Forgive me if this was discussed at Wednesday night's meeting, but I didn't see it in the staff report. I understand that Diablo Canyon is scheduled to close in a phased manner between 2024 and 2025, and there's currently a movement to ask for the early closure of Diablo Canyon, which would require many, many things to happen. And I just want to give staff the opportunity to respond about the likelihood of that happening and the obstacles. And you touched on it a little bit, but I'd love to hear more about that.
So I think the number of obstacles. One of the obstacles is Diablo Canyon provides 2,200 megawatts of resource adequacy. So that's critical capacity that the system, California electric system, relies on. If you're going, when they're retiring it, part of the plan is that you need to identify replacement capacity, and you want to identify zero emission replacement capacity, because we don't want to end up building a new gas plant to be able to, or having to operate the natural gas fleet that we have in a significantly more polluting manner than they already are. So I think that's one of the main considerations. There are a whole slew of issues with the federal government as well. So it's not just the PUC that solely governs when it will be retired. You know, there's also, I think it's the Department of Energy, or is it FERC or the Department of Energy license? NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So they have a license, and so you'd have to, the federal government would have to agree. That's a multi-year process. So by the time the NRC is likely to make a decision, you may already find yourself in 2024.
Yeah, there were also community impacts. It actually was a big driver because Diablo's a huge employer in San Luis Obispo. And so, I mean, it may have even been the most intensely litigated issue in that the PUC was kind of how to manage that. And ultimately went to the legislature to provide additional funding to San Luis Obispo to mitigate the impacts of the plant closure. So you'd have to revisit some of that as well, because that was all predicated on a 2024, 2025 shutdown.
I will say, you know, from a policy perspective, you know, if you were to ask me, would you recommend East Bay Community Energy sign on to a request for early closure? You know, I think we'd want to evaluate the specifics of the request more deeply, but I don't know if there's I don't see any specific reason why we wouldn't want to have a serious dialogue about potentially supporting it, because there are broad benefits to all ratepayers of Diablo Canyon. So I think it's important to disassociate this question of allocation from supporting Diablo Canyon. One can seek to retire Diablo Canyon sooner and still try to capture the monetary benefits of an allocation of carbon-free energy. I will note that the City of San Jose's CCA, their city manager has recommended to the City Council in San Jose to take the allocation. So that's the one public CCA that has, you know, stated intent. Mostly it's in the context of the PCIA and the increase in the PCIA and the significant revenue reduction. So there, you know, is obviously an active dialogue. Every CCA is having a similar conversation. And it's unfortunate that we're in this tough position. I think this is not a place that I personally want to be, having to think about whether or not we take Diablo Canyon into the mix. That's, you know, if we had a better outcome at the PUC and the PCIA, we wouldn't be here.
So thank you for those answers. I want to agree with some of the speakers in just saying that I'd like to have more information on a cost-benefit analysis for all of the different scenarios before I feel comfortable going down one particular path or another. But maybe as of 2-3 hours earlier today, we've got some answers that still need to be analyzed, but we can maybe do a better job for ourselves in predicting the different scenarios that we might see ourselves in over the next 2 years.
Supervisor Haggerty? Thank you, Councilmember Martinez.
So, Nick, you had mentioned the City of San Jose and their recommendation. Are other CCAs looking at this, and what are they doing?
So I believe Silicon Valley Clean Energy has, they haven't made a final decision, but I believe Silicon Valley Clean Energy, which is Santa Clara County, they have, I believe the direction they've given to staff is for 2020 only to take the allocation and sell it, not to take the allocation and use it. They have also taken, they are also considering changing their power content to reduce the renewable content in their power mix as a mitigation strategy. PCE, I don't believe, has taken this issue up yet. Peninsula San Mateo County. I believe Monterey Bay, which serves San Luis Obispo and actually serves the communities where many of the employees at Diablo Canyon live. The indication I've gotten is that the expectation is they will take the allocation. As I said, San Jose, there's a recommendation from the city manager to take the allocation. I don't believe MCE has gotten formal board direction yet. So those are the examples that I have. So it's mixed.
So to take it and sell it, if you took it, I'm trying to figure out what is the delta, what is the, you know, if you sell it, are you going to lose money? You know, what
Yeah,
is that?
I
mean,
think indicatively we found there's not much of a market for it. So you at the very, best, you won't make very much money. You might not have to pay somebody for it. You might just be able to basically sell it at, zero or close to zero. The question is, how deep is the market for it? There may be other CCAs that say, hey, we're willing, we want to take very low cost carbon-free energy, so we'll buy it from you. I think we're exploring the sale options there. The benefit of taking it and selling it would be PG&E doesn't get to count it towards their carbon-free content anymore.
Okay, so what I'm not clear on is, if my esteemed colleague is talking about bankruptcy and things like that, and I've often felt like he knows a lot more about this issue than I. Not that he's been privy, I think he just understands it a little bit better than me. And I'm trying to figure out, if we don't take it, we go business as usual, we put less into the reserves, we put less in the local development business plan, can it be business as usual? Or are we still down that bankruptcy path?
So I don't think there's no scenario where there's no scenario where we're going into bankruptcy, because we always have the ability to raise rates.
Yeah, but one of the premises, and look, I'm out of here in a year and you can do whatever you want, but one of the premises, and I always felt that our rates being 1.5% lower than PG&E was not very aspirational. And I always felt like we could have done better. So it's going to be hard. I'm going to be hard pressed to raise rates. Okay? And I'm uncomfortable with this discussion because it could be misconstrued, because it could go out in the public saying, well, they were talking about raising rates today, and they're talking about selling nuclear, and there's a lot of things. They talked about bankruptcy, and there's a lot of things. So I'm uncomfortable about talking about this stuff because I think it could be misconstrued into the public. But for me anyways, I'm having a hard time putting my arms around it, and nor do I intend to tip my hand until the time that I vote, to be very honest with you, because quite frankly, and I'm sure Anna Olivia is going to call me now, but quite frankly, this is a very, very big issue, and I want to keep listening up till the last public speaker after I've heard from you and the public. I don't intend to tip my hand either way as to where I'm going until I believe I understand this 100%, because I do think it puts a mark on us if we do take it. I understand the financial viability of the organization. And the last thing I would want to do in the last year is hurt it. But, there's just so much information out there, and some that I don't have yet. So that's kind of where I'm at. But, it might even take some time sitting and talking to you.
Thank you, Supervisor. Okay, so a couple things. I generally agree that we should consider supporting early closure of Diablo Canyon. That would save all ratepayers money. I'm not an expert on this, but from what I know, it's pretty unlikely that that'll be successful. But that doesn't mean that it's not worth trying and to put our weight behind it, at least rhetorically. So I would support that coming back. I agree with one of the comments you made about if we decide that nuclear is dirty and off limits for us, then we should not count it as part of PG&E's cleanness when we're comparing ourselves to them. That just makes sense, right? If we make that decision that it's dirty, it's just as bad as fossil fuels. If we make that decision, fine. But let's not then say that we have to, compare our cleanness to them, including the nuclear, if we've deemed that as an unacceptable option. It's impossible to discuss this in a vacuum anymore. The PCIA is so tied up into this, because I'm worried that the PCIA increases will come down, and we are going to be faced with some really crappy decisions. Right? I mean, if the PCIA comes in, we've got a $70 million, surplus this year. If the PCIA increase comes down and it cuts that to, 10 million, that's not great, but we can sort of continue doing what we're doing right now without, not make any changes and get by. Our reserves will grow slower, but, it's not like we would be under the gun to make, cuts somewhere. And my general feeling is that that's, probably what we should try to do. Maybe some cuts around the edges here and there, but not anything, no drastic changes. But if the PCIA increases, the worst case scenarios or something close to it, and we're looking at a $50 million deficit, this year, we will not have any good choices, folks. We are going to have to make some decisions that we don't like. I would love to not face that decision. But my understanding is that we're not really going to know about the PCIA until we're right around the time that we're going to have to make the decision, right? It's not like they're going to say, hey, we're going to do this, have 6 months to talk about it and decide what you're going to do to react. It's more likely to be a matter of weeks or maybe a couple months. Is that a fair assessment?
So the decision you're talking about here is the decision on whether to take the nuke or not?
No, I'm talking about the CPUC's decision on the PCIA increase for this year.
You'll know what that's going to be by the end of February. And so, actually, you know right now the increase is going to be ½ cent. The real question is what happens when that undercollection hits, and we have a pretty good notion that that'll be, late August. So those are kind of the points at which things will happen on the rate front. But sitting here today that it's going to go up by ½ cent in May. I don't know if that impacts your timing.
And that ½ cent impact has what impact to our bottom line? Just the ½ cent?
So it's the ½ cent is about
microphone, please.
About a third.
Microphone, please.
I'm sorry.
The ½ cent is about a third of the overall forecast increase is 1.5 cents, so it's roughly a third. So if you think it's
so 40 million.
40 million. So
So we could survive that.
We would still be operating with a positive margin with a 40 million reduction.
Yeah, and so in that case, there's no urgent need to,
Well, you know that's a temporary condition, right? The question is how bad is the change whenever the change happens, and that's where the crystal ball gets really cloudy.
Understood.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's that murky area that I'm.
Yeah. So you don't know exactly when that's going to hit. We know we're going to see requests circa August, September, but we don't know when the commission's going to act on it, and we don't know how they're going to act on it.
Okay. So I agree with my colleague. Director Martinez, that it's really difficult to prioritize or even try to without having some numbers attached to these things. And so I think that needs to come back. What is a 0.1% reduction in our discount? What's the impact of that? And then we can do the math to figure out, beyond that. What is the financial impact of the nuclear? What is how much could we save by, you talked about there are more options. We could lay off staff. We could eliminate the local development business plan. There are other options. They all are horrible. But I think staff should make an effort to present all of them that are, realistic. We obviously can't take staffing down to zero, right? But maybe they're, around the margin. So we need you to think about that and come back with at least some rough numbers before we can, I think, provide a prioritization that's meaningful.
I think fundamentally what I'm really looking for is, should we even consider continuing? And from your perspectives, should we have taking the nuclear allocation as a scenario? Because if the feeling is just unequivocally no, then we might as well not look at it as one of the tools. But if it's a tool to say what's a tool that we should evaluate, then we will absolutely consider that as part of the evaluation.
I'm not willing to take it off the table yet.
Yeah, Scott, did you want to? Your mic is on. Did you want to chime in? Okay.
I like Diane, I think that I would like to see us continue to work through it. I would like to say I have no intention of laying off staff. No, I know, but I'm really, like I said earlier, I'm really worried about this conversation. We've heard a lot of different words that are like huge red flags. So, and I'm not saying you were advocating for that.
No,
Mr.
certainly
Chairman.
not.
So,
I love our staff. You guys are doing a great job.
I do too, but no, I'm still listening.
Yeah. I don't think, I agree with my colleagues. In the worst case scenario, we can't take any of these items off the table for at least consideration. They're all bad choices, but we can't take any of them off the table quite yet until we have more certainty around the PCIA. Like I said, if the PCIA comes in at the $40 million hit, everything's off the table. We don't need to do any of those things. If it comes in higher, maybe when it comes in higher, the conversation's going to be harder.
Absolutely, and I think generally, from my perspective, if we see a significant improvement in the PCIA or the PG&E rate situation, I think that very easily, sort of from a staff recommendation perspective, shifts towards, well, let's not consider the nuclear allocation if we don't need it.
Right.
It really is a last resort type of option, but right now, given all the uncertainty, we have to, from my perspective, keep those options on the table to evaluate.
Okay. Did you want to add something?
Nope, I'm just here. I'm just here in case I can. So.
Okay, my colleagues, anything else? Okay. All right. Thank you. I apologize for using some words that were unpleasant, but we've got to be able to have these conversations somewhere, and I don't know how to do it in a way that doesn't, raise some potential concerns, really.
I wasn't admonishing anybody, so I don't think you need to apologize, but I'm just saying, my concern is that we know we have to have these conversations, and we know we're the government, so we have to have these in public. I just get concerned how they get translated out into the community, but we'll see where it goes.
I couldn't agree more. Okay, item 6, board member and staff announcements, including requests to place items on future board agendas. Director Martinez.
I just wanted to thank staff for the lunch we had at Pixar on Tuesday, which was a select group of some of our larger customers, and a presentation on distributed energy resources. And the feedback I got from my city staff was that it was a very well-run event, and it was, and we hope to see those continue in our communities with those customers for customer retention and development.
Great, thank you. Any other announcements, staff? Okay, then thank you all. We're adjourned. All right, next meeting is February 28th, and it's going to be at the County Administration Building in Oakland.